Thank you, Regina, for this kind words of introduction. And as you've heard, I am an interventional cardiologist. I live in Tampa, Florida, in the USA. And so been here almost 25, 26 years in the US, and originally from Hyderabad, went to school and all of that there. So again, once, thank you for asking me to do this presentation. And we're going to talk about preventive strategies and the current situation of cardiovascular health as it is mostly in India and what we can do to change that. All right. So let me see. Okay. So this presentation is mostly for educational purposes. I don't practice medicine in India, and this is not a professional or a medical advice, nor are we forming a patient-doctor relationship. That's with your local doctors in India. And before as you receive this information, before you make any personal changes, please consult with your local physician. Extremely important. And I have no financial disclosures. I have no conflict of interest. I work for the US VA system. So for all practical purposes, from a financial disclosure point of view, I am a public servant. And the reason I do this, when a lot of friends and family ask in India, it's just a labor of love. And the only, interest that I have, in addition to what I do for a living, is I run a nonprofit organization here in Tampa called pblm.org. We'll talk about it toward the end. And one of the first question is, I'm an interventional cardiologist, right? Hey, the likes of me usually don't talk about prevention. The likes of me don't spend Saturday afternoon giving presentations across the world to prevent disease. So in effect, what I'm trying to do, or what my message entails, is the message of how to make someone like myself go jobless, right? So that's exactly what I'm doing. So what am I doing and why am I doing? So my story, if you want to look it up, as to how did I transition from, I'm still an interventional cardiologist. I do a lot of procedures almost on a daily basis. But how did I transition to doing that in the silo of a deep, dark, lead-shielded cardiac cath lab, to meeting patients, friends, families, and now general why am I doing this? And my story as a narrative, I wrote it as an essay a couple of years ago in the American College of Lifestyle Medicine's online publication. It's open access. You just Google, I have a carrot and a stent. You pick, and you put my name next to it. You should be able to read, as to my own personal and professional transition as to how I got there. And yes, I am one of those crazy people who went to the hospital with that very phrase right underneath my name. So, not necessarily for a stent, but I use that line as a metaphor to talk about how much of this disease is preventable, and also as a conversation starter for my patients, friends, and family members. So a couple of questions I want to start with is that why are we all here? It's Saturday evening in India, and it's you probably are wondering, why am I not watching a movie or celebrating some event with family, or why am I watching this some cardiologists that I never met from across the world? And same thing for me, why are we all here? So at the end of the day, yes, some of us are physicians, some of us are not, but we are all human, right? So at the end of the day, even, believe it or not, across the world, the leading cause of death amongst cardiologists is heart disease, right? Shocking, but that tells us the human side of who we are, our strengths and our limitations. But the core of the message is that we all want to be healthy because we are just as human, even as physicians, right? So the main objective of this lesson, or this discussion, I want to call it, is that I would like for this PowerPoint to somehow transition into a personal commitment, both for physicians and non-physicians, and also a professional commitment. And if you perceive this discussion as a monotonous one-way lecture, I would like for this lecture to somehow transition into a better lifestyle. So that's my main objective. If I succeed, I would be very happy about it. If it doesn't, it's a PowerPoint that I put together, but unless it changes into your personal habits and into your pantry, it is pointless. So that's my goal, and I hope I'll meet my own and your expectations today. So the question now is that what does health actually mean to us? A lot of times we don't take time to sit down for a minute and think about it. But when you think about it, believe it or not, there is actually an agreed upon definition put forth by the World Health Organization almost over a generation ago. So health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So a lot of us may be disease-free or are free of a medical condition. Does that necessarily make us healthy if we are compromising other components of who we are as humans? So health, believe it or not, is an inside job. And for discussions like this, the English word healthy can be broken apart into heal thyself, meaning that majority of staying healthy is actually an inside job. It's in our hands. And you can technically, literally take that word into, all of our ancestral roots. Swast, Sanskrit or Hindi word for health is literally, you don't even have to break it apart, a conjugation of self consciousness. That's what the word comes from. Swast is nothing but a conjugation in Sanskrit of two separate words, which mean inner consciousness. So this is what I mean by health is an inside job. So at this point, I would like to bring about a concept, and with a clear distinction, is the concept of maintaining health versus managing disease. Most of us physicians, including people like Regina and other physicians in the group, no matter what we practice, what we are trained to do, and what we do for the most part is we maintain disease. We manage disease. We rarely get involved in maintaining health. And that was one of my personal transition points, because in the American education system, if you were to become an interventional cardiologist, it is 17 years of uninterrupted training after high school. So you spend those 17 years just training, and you graduate, and you put 10, 15, 20 years of experience behind you. And one day you wake up from self-induced coma, and you find out that all that you're doing is putting band-aids on leaking dams. And you find out that all that you're doing is managing disease, and you're not maintaining health. So that was a moment of rude awakening for me a few years ago. And that's what transitioned for me to make a humble plea to as many people as I potentially could to stop this. And speaking of health being a responsibility, in 1975, Chicago Tribune said this about the American society, that the idea of preventive medicine is faintly un-American. It means first recognizing that the enemy is us. What saddens me when I read this every single time when I do this type of presentations is that this statement is now not only more applicable to American society, it is applicable to pretty much the rest of the world, except for very few small pockets of healthy societies. Is that most of the current disease burden is due to lack of personal responsibility or personal awareness. So the question that, if I were to put each one of you on the spot and ask you, hey, let's take a minute, and I want all of you to answer this question for me, which we are not going to do today because of the interest of time, but I do this with my patients every Friday when I do the lifestyle medicine discussions, is why do you want to be healthy? And no matter how detailed and how descriptive and how passionate your answers are, all of your answers will fall into two broad categories. We want to be healthy because we want to maintain a good quality of life, right? And two, we want to maintain that quality of life for as long as possible, right? So now, although I'm showing these two entities in two separate boxes, they are inseparable. They are like two sides of a coin, and as a circle. And for those of us, no matter what religion, what language we speak, from a spiritual or from a from the deep roots point of view, life being a circle for those of us with Indian ancestry is not a foreign concept. Right? But what I would like to do is take you through a journey from life actually being a circle in the previous slide. I want to take you through a journey and hopefully convince you the way how I see life as a box. So what we're going to do here, take you through the journey of 100 years using those two parameters. That we want to be healthy because we want to have a good quality of life, and we want a good quantity of life in terms of longevity. So we're going to take those two and draw ourselves a graph. So let's go back 100 years ago. In 1920, the average person in India died at an age of 29. That was the average life expectancy in 1920 in India was 29 years. During those short 29 years, the quality of life dwindled down very rapidly because people did not have access to anything that we take for granted. Simple things like clean running water, simple things like having access to universal vaccination, antibiotics, being able to go see a primary care doctor, access to clean food, right? And all of this were not available. And not to mention other major social issues. So because of those reasons, those people lived very short lives and they died miserably, for lack of better words. Now you fast forward to 2020 or 2021, and average life expectancy now is 65. So it doubled, right? And nowhere in recorded human history this has happened. That average life expectancies are doubling. And this is not just true for India, this is actually true for the richest of the rich countries and the poorest of the poor countries on the planet. That in the past 100 to 150, but unfortunately, our life's curve today is, and what's happening is that very early on, people are gaining weight. And this is true even in India now. Majority of urban society, if you look at children, and we're going to talk about that as we go into the details of the presentation. Before you know, almost every Indian household, before they're between 40 and 45, they're popping blood pressure medications. Then diabetes, India, I don't need to tell you guys as to how bad the diabetes situation is in India. And as a consequence of that, India is now officially per capita the world's capital of male erectile sexual dysfunction, and which as a surrogate and a precursor for cardiovascular disease. And then the kidney disease is on the rise. And then heart, hemodialysis, patients go on dialysis, and then a cancer or two. But sadly, yes, while we are living longer, we are also dying longer. Right? What I argue, what people like myself, Dr. Regina, or in the people who live in the space of healthy living or lifestyle medicine, what we argue is that 90% of the things that killed us for eons since humans evolved on this planet was infection and famine. Most people are no longer dying due to those things. Even in the era of COVID, most people are not dying due to infection and famine. So is it unreasonable to ask ourselves to live a life where we take complete control of things that we are actually in control of, and live a life that looks like this, where at any given time you drop the line down, that the life should look like a box, right? So the concept here is live long and die short. So now, if you draw our life's curve or life's graph against quality of life and quantity of life, it should look like a box. Because no matter how hard we try, one day we're all going to end up in a box. So social anthropologists call this concept the rectangularization of life. Is that our life's graph, when plotted against quality and longevity, no matter what age we die at, should look like a box. So that's kind of my brief introductory words as to what is the philosophy behind wanting to do all of this and share this message. But in terms of this Regina had asked me to specifically talk about cardiovascular disease and cardiovascular prevention in India. So the current status, at the turn of the century, cardiovascular disease is now the leading cause of mortality in India. The number one killer in India is no longer infectious diseases; it are preventable, non-communicable diseases. An Indian currently is being diagnosed and dying of heart disease 10 years earlier compared to the rest of the human population. And look at the deaths due to heart disease before 70, right? Deaths before age 70 due to cardiovascular disease is about 23% in the Western world, and it's 52% in India. And for every case, when you get diagnosed, an Indian tends to have higher chances of dying. Right? And there's been a huge epidemiological shift. right? In the past, 40, 50, 60 years post-independence, there has been a 50% decrease in mortality due to malnutrition and infection. And this is not just unique to India, that's been happening all over the world. As a consequence of that, the average life expectancy has gone up quite a bit. And as a consequence of life expectancy going up and a lot of people joining workforce and working for longer years, there's been a little bit influx of money. And as a consequence of that, the affluence and what people eat also has changed. And then what we're dealing with as a bigger consequence of all of that is that 50% of the non-communicable diseases, 50% of the non-communicable diseases are now due to heart disease and cardiovascular disease. And that is true both in urban and rural areas, right? And 25% of all deaths, 1 in 4 deaths in India are now due to cardiovascular disease, which in majority of individuals is preventable. So the global population for every 100,000, which is 1 lakh, for every 100,000 deaths in India, in the world, is 235 are due to cardiovascular disease. In India, it's 272, right? And within the realm of cardiovascular disease, ischemic heart disease, which is basically blockages in your heart, and stroke contribute 83% of all of cardiovascular disease in India. And there's been a 59% of increase, 59%, almost 60% increase in the number of lives lost due to cardiovascular disease between 1999 and 2010. It's a very short period of time. The disease has taken like skyrocketing. And there's been a 14-fold increase in urban areas. And if you really look at it, although the absolute numbers are a little different, but it's shocking to find out there is a 7-fold increase in rural areas. And between 2005 and 2015, there's been a 70% increase of cardiovascular risk factors and the disease burden. And the number one is hypertension. High blood pressure contributes to, it's gone up. The prevalence of hypertension in India has gone up by 138% between 1990 and 2013. This is a unique exception because the rest of the planet, every country on the planet, high blood pressure numbers are actually going down. India is an exception to it. And because of all of this, the cost of cardiovascular disease burden was expected between 2005 and 2015 to be 250 billion US dollars. Now it's actually expected to be over $3 trillion. So the question is why? Why India does have so much burden? Number one, believe it or not, if you take the entire population across the country, so those of us who live in the major cities like Hyderabad and Bangalore or Delhi may not be seeing actually what's happening in rural areas unless you are from a rural village and you move to one of the major cities. You have a perspective. But 30% of Indians are still smoking. And if you go to some of the states like Mizoram and eastern states, it's up to 67%. And the prevalence and the number of people who are picking up smoking for the first time, youth, is actually going up. And close to 1 in 3 Indians are diagnosed with high blood pressure. It is expected that by 2025, 213 million people in India will have diagnosed hypertension. And like I mentioned earlier, India is an exception where the prevalence is continuously growing up. And diabetes, again, this is now officially the world's capital. In the past decades, it had doubled. Okay, diabetes has doubled in the urban areas. How about rural areas? Yes, the rural areas numbers may not be absolutely high, but if you look at as proportion of the population, it quadrupled. There are close to 100 million diabetics, or there will be close to 100 million. That is like the 1/3 of American population are going to be diabetics in India. And 70 to 80 million that we don't know are currently pre-diabetics. And pre-diabetes is not a benign condition. Pre-diabetes is actually damaging your end organs. And how about cholesterol and lipid parameters? Only 20% of India has a normal lipid parameters. 80% of Indians have abnormal lipid parameters, the most common one being hypertriglyceridemia. And it has the significance of this is crazy because it's gradually increasing the prevalence. If you really look from 1980 to all the way to 2000, that's what I was able to pull up the data from, and the numbers of LDL prevalence across the country, across the population, that is more than 100, and triglycerides more than 150. It's rapidly going up, and awareness is less than 18%, even in rural urban areas, right? Villages, we can say that maybe there's the healthcare system is not robust, and so they don't have access to it. But it turns out that only less than 18% of the people who live in the cities are actually aware that their cholesterol numbers are bad, and only less than 8% are actually being treated, and less than 5% are actually under control. So when we say that there's this mysterious heart attacks happening in India, it turns out that if you really take a deep breath and sit down and ask these detailed questions, it turns out that majority of the Indian population actually fits well into known risk factors. There's been a lot of coverage about what happened to Ganguly recently, but we don't know the details of his health. I was saying to some of my friends that if I were Saurav Ganguly, and if I had a heart attack needing a stent at 48, as a service to my country and my society, I would have made every single one of my medical records and every single one of my heart scans be made public. And say, hey guys, this is who I am. This is actually what happened to me. So that way, you're actually doing a community service. But I don't think that was done. In terms of obesity, right? And it's rapidly increasing. And in India, one of the things that we actually can, there's the name called TOFI, TOFI, which is very common in Indian society, which is thin on the outside but fat on the inside, TOFI. So BMI may not be a best metric for the Indian society, but a better one is to take a tape measure and measure around your belly, right around the belly button level at the umbilicus level. So that measurement, either in centimeters or inches, should not exceed half of your height. So I want to repeat that. The measurement around your belly button of your waist should not exceed more than half of your height. If that happens, it doesn't really matter how many push-ups you can do and how much you can bench press. That tells me that you have truncal obesity. And the truncal obesity is an independent risk factor for multiple medical conditions. And in what's happening in childhood obesity, that we have about 52 studies as of 2010 showing that close to 20% of Indian children are actually obese now. It was never the case when I was a kid, when most of you were children, when most of us kids in India, we did not see this many obese children as our friends or in our villages. So this is a new trend that is rapidly encroaching onto Indian society. And this has happened over a very short period of time. And it is expected that by next year, 50% of Indian women would be obese, which is just about as bad as it is here in the US. 50%. That is the expectation. And when it comes to physical activity, it turns out that 50% of the Indian population is physically inactive. Half of the population is absolutely doing no routine physical activity. Less than 10% of the population has a structured routine activity discipline, less than 10%. And when it comes to diet, because this is also a risk factor, fat intake has gone up significantly. And a majority of our fat intake are these ultra refined oils, right? We soak our food in oils. It's almost like food is floating. You have to look for food somewhere in the middle of a puddle of oil. Right? A lot of people still cook like that. And then on top of that, what we cook in that oil are ultra refined carbohydrates. And on top of that, this meat intake, right? It was never like that. Again, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm 50 years old, will be 51 in May. But when I was a kid growing up in India, we eat small, one half of a chicken between family of four, maybe once or twice a month. That's about it. But now people are eating chicken biryani almost, so frequently that it's shocking. Chicken biryani is soaked in oil. You can literally take a fistful of it and squeeze oil out of it. And an additional burden is the amount rapid growth in fast food and sugary drinks. It's a 14,000 crore business in India, one of the most rapidly growing on the planet. On top of that, what could go wrong? You're gorging yourself on an ultra refined processed carbohydrate and a processed meat, and washing it down with carbonated beverages with sugar. So it turns out that this is a very interesting study. I really like this data. Is that a couple of researchers in India went around and asked their families and children to see how frequently are our kids consuming this, more than 4 times per week. It turns out 51% of Indian children who were surveyed are consuming more than 4 times a week of fruit juices. 21% are consuming carbonated beverages, and 18% are sugar sweetened beverages, and 20% of kids are indulging in more than 4 servings a week of ice cream. And no wonder childhood obesity is in India now is almost 20%. Right? So how does that burden compare to United States? Right? Dr. Prabhakaran, some of you may know him, is a pretty well established and a highly respected cardiologist at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences. And so when you compare, it's actually worse compared to the United States statistics and the global population. The cardiovascular disease burden in India looks worse. So how can we fix this? Right? What do we have at our disposal? So we have these 6 pillars that are time tested, fairly well evidence-based. And what I would like to do is to take you through the journey of this. Why do I so strongly believe that lifestyle medicine, simple 6 pillars of lifestyle medicine, will fix majority of this burden? So let's take a look at this. Each one of them: smoking, diabetes, hypertension, hypercholesterolemia or high cholesterol levels, and the combination of the first 3. Just see what happens to the risk when you add the first 3, and then any of the first 4. Every single one of these factors that contribute to cardiovascular, every single one of them is a lifestyle parameter. On top of that, a component that we don't talk much about, or we rarely talk about, is this burden imposed by the psychological factors, the social factors, the emotional factors have a huge bearing on cardiovascular disease. So every single one of them is directly or indirectly connected to one of those 6 pillars. Hence, my strong belief that this disease, the leading cause of death across the human race, is preventable, treatable, and potentially even reversible, quote unquote, in majority of patients. So why do I so strongly believe it? What is my why? In the few slides ago, I asked, why do you want to be healthy? So if you ask me why I do this, why do I focus so much on prevention as an interventional cardiologist, is because I borrow inspiration from a man who invented or pioneered cardiac transplantation. Christian Barnard famously said that I've saved the lives of 150 people by doing heart transplants. If I had focused on preventive medicine earlier, I would have saved 150 million, right? So again, goes back to the same question. Why do you want to be healthy? So you gave me an answer. You all gave me an answer, and I gave myself an answer when we asked this question, not as some fancy physicians, but as just fellow human beings. We come up with an answer. The fundamental concept in lifestyle medicine is the concept of mindfulness. And mindful about what, you may ask me, is the mindfulness about the answers that came about. Meaning that if you ask me, hey, why do you want to be healthy? I'm going to say, I want to be a part of my family. I want to be healthy. I want to have fun with them. I want to travel with them. I want to, share every aspect of life with them. But am I being mindful towards that answer? So that's what I mean by mindfulness. Is that, are we being mindful about this? Is that, why indulge in so many unhealthy habits and be dependent on pharmaceuticals and procedures like the ones that I do? And then I wonder, hey, why is my health suffering? So that's what I mean by mindfulness, not necessarily, finding yourself a rosary and come back with a halo, behind your head. That's not the kind of mindfulness I'm talking about. The kind of mindfulness I'm talking about is the one that forces us, that the one that inspires us to be true to our answers and live the life, the best possible way we want to. And to bring about the change, right, you have to actively think through it. And change could be hard, because if I'm going to ask, if any one of us is going to ask a family member, a patient, or a friend to change and undo a lifetime worth of habits, it's going to be difficult. But the way to look at it is baby steps, right? And tiny, tiny little steps, 1/100th of a change. That this has been proven beyond doubt in behavioral science, that if you bring about 1/100, that's all, tiny little change every single day, you will gain enormously. The concept is called the power of small gains. Another way of showing this is that if I ask you to climb to the clouds and to reach the pinnacle of your life, and I give you two ladders, one ladder with tiny little small steps, another ladder with steps that you can't even reach, which one will get you there to the top first? It's the one which enables you to take baby steps. So that's where most people fail, is that they try to take these huge leaps of faith, and then they do have some success, then they realize that, oh wow, this is unattainable, and they fall back. So baby steps. And these two quotes, I really like them, that the master has failed more times than the beginner has even tried. And also in terms of habits, if we are what we repeatedly do, excellence then is a habit, not a gift. So for those of you who are not practicing this, but you want to bring about a change, the fundamental concept is adapt a beginner's mind. Assume that we don't know any much about this, the concepts of pillars of lifestyle medicine, and be non-judgmental. Be non-judgmental about what you're doing and what others are doing, and be very patient. Be accepting of failures, and make it a non-striving approach, because this is not a competition. Because this, you just want to find out what can bring out the healthiest you out of yourself, and trust yourself while you're doing this, and trust some advice from professionals like Dr. Sachin, and let go of failures. And that's what mindfulness is about. You have to actively think about this. And to do all of this, what tools do we have? Again, I go back to the same concept. To do all of this, we have simple 6 tools, except for having to pay a little bit to buy our own food. If you kind of take a closer look, everything else is free. Everything else is free, right? Is there a science? So this is what Dr. Regina was alluding to earlier, is that is there scientific evidence to support all of this, right? Yes. So we're going to take one pillar at a time, social relationships. Right? It turns out a meta-analysis of 148 studies clearly showed that the number one thing that allows you, if all of us, let's say we all want to live to be 100, what is the first thing that we want to do? Is to be a part of a close-knit community. That does a lot of miracles. And there's actually very impressive data. And unfortunately, social isolation, much like in the West, is now rapidly growing in India, especially with the elderly. In the US, it's really bad, right? In the US, it's really bad, and it's really rapidly increasing in terms of social isolation. And right, so that's number one, is social support. We need social support. Extremely, I cannot emphasize more. That's why I always, when I talk about lifestyle, pillars of lifestyle medicine, I always open with social relationships. The next one is tobacco. So at least in America, this used to be a society where cardiologists promoted tobacco. And the industry sold tobacco for pregnant women for a healthy child. Not too long ago, there are still men and women alive who lived through this. So this is not some ancient 15th century. So if you're interested, there's a fascinating book called The Cigarette, A Political History. You can look into it. But do I need to talk about smoking cessation in 2021? And the answer is absolutely true. Just to give you an example, 5 years before I came to America, America was debating whether we should ban smoking on a commercial airline or not. Just 5 years before I came to the US in 1990. So, and smoking, doesn't really spare any part of the body. And so, how does it look in India? We talked about it. Close to 30% of the population is smoking, but majority of the use of tobacco in India is non-smoke tobacco, right? It's the use of tobacco, not necessarily smoking. It's the use of tobacco in non-smoking forms, right? And that unfortunately is growing. It's almost like a fashion these days. And the thing with alcohol is that this concept called, drink responsibly and drink moderately, I never really understood what drinking moderately meant, because India, as a per capita consumer of single malt whiskey, is now officially in the top 3 countries on the planet. And when we say to people that drink 1 drink for women and drink 2 for men, I really just never understood this recommendation, because in one hand, every single organization, every single cancer prevention organization on the planet have come together and said alcohol is a group 1 carcinogen. Alcohol is listed as among one of the most carcinogenic things that we have a choice, right? There are some carcinogens that we get exposed to that we have no choice, like exposure to sunlight. But why would we expose ourselves to 1 to 2 drinks of a group 1 carcinogen? So my plea is that if you drink, please do yourself a favor. Don't drink saying that it is good for you, right? It's listed as a group 1 carcinogen. So the next burden is emotional stress. So like this famous saying goes, that a diamond is a piece of coal. It's nothing but a piece of coal that handles stress exceptionally well. So that's what stress is about. I agree that it's easier said than done, but most of the stress is what we feel and how we react to it than the stress itself. And the emotional stress, a couple of my classmates are pretty well established and popular psychiatrists in India, and I hear them talk about this all the time. The emotional stress burden in India is growing extremely rapidly. And the stress is an acute stress and a chronic stress, both stimulate an effect on insulin resistance, right? And on top of that, you combine this with obesity, smoking, low physical activity. They all kind of go hand in hand with depression. And people don't talk about this much. There's probably Indian society still has a lot of taboo not to talk about this openly, but this is a huge burden in India. And on top of that, socioeconomic stress. People, societies that live, poverty, joblessness, job-related stress, all of this actually have biological pathways that directly affect cardiovascular disease. So mind, as the Sanskrit saying goes, yad bhavam tad bhavati, right? Your existence is a manifestation of your thought. Or the same person also said, bhavanatmakaram jagat, meaning that, again, the world is a manifestation of your thought. And in terms of physical activity, so this dude is spending a little bit more time because on the treadmill, because his doctor said so. So it turns out that India is now ranked officially as the 8th worst on the planet when it comes to societal physical activity. So what we recommend, in at least for the US guidelines, which should be applicable to pretty much all of human race, is that at least 30 minutes of moderate intense activity, right? 5 to 7 days a week, or 25 minutes of vigorous activity or high intensity activity. So, but in a simple practical point of view, do something that you enjoy and do it consistently for almost on all days of the week, if possible, and enjoy doing it. And turns out that majority of the benefit, right? It's not about trying to be a marathon runner. Majority of this benefit actually comes within the first 15 to 20 minutes of doing it. The key is to being able to do it consistently, of some type of physical activity of your choosing, and you enjoy doing it. No point in going to the gym and being yelled at by your instructor while you hate being at the gym. Instead, you want to be playing racquetball. So that's what you should be doing. So pick up something that you actually enjoy doing it, do it consistently. And behind their cooking is a culture, a family heritage, a personal choice. So everybody is quote unquote an expert, right? So that's what has done to nutrition, is why there is so much confusion and so much there's no confusion about smoking cessation, there's no confusion about sleep, there's none of that. The entire confusion in lifestyle medicine is about only one pillar, nutrition, because it is such a deeply personal thing. So, and then that leads to diet wars. And I said this once, a couple of years ago, and it became kind of popular, is that while the ketos and the phytos are fighting the battle, the Cheetos are winning the war, right? And is that it's the junk food. And the number one race, the number one paradigm or number one principle is to minimize or eliminate all processed food. That's rule number one. So before we go there, stop looking at food as carbs, protein, and fat. Right? You don't go to Sabji Mandi or some grocery store in India and look for, hey, today I'm going to buy 6 carbohydrates, 7 proteins, and 8 fats. Right? But you don't tell your mom when you're cooking, hey, mom, cook me some nice fat for dinner tonight. Right? Nobody talks about food like that. But when we open a scientific discussion, all of a sudden we talk about food in molecules. Right? So that, and the reason is because some of it is industry that invaded science and public opinion, and left a big confusion, and which still continues. So there's a beautiful paper from the National Institute of Health last year, or 2019, I should say, published, I believe in the Lancet, about what happens with processed foods. Right? Processed foods is like, and people ask me, I joke about this, people ask me, what is a processed food? I know what I joke about this. Processed food is like pornography. You know it when you see it. There's no definition for it. Well, there is definition for it, but from a simplistic point of view, right? And in terms of how food affects each component of cardiovascular health, right? And we know this from the DASH trial, that a diet that is predominantly plant-based drops the blood pressure like a brick. So much so that to approve a drug, the United States, for blood pressure, the United States FDA requires only a drop in 3 millimeters of blood pressure. But on a completely plant-based diet or a DASH diet with salt restriction, the blood pressure drops by up to 20 millimeters. Just think about that. Right? And that's one of the reasons why DASH diet made it to a class 1 indication with level of evidence A. There are very few things in cardiovascular medicine that do this. And a predominantly plant-based DASH diet is one of them. And if most people eat like that, I will not be prescribing blood pressure medications. Same thing with cholesterol, right? There's a beautiful paper that clearly shows that vegetarian and plant-based diets can be and should be used as an alternative, especially when the intent of treatment is primary prevention. Right? And say multiple studies, this is a portfolio study that clearly showed that people who eat predominantly or exclusively a plant-based diet drop their cholesterol numbers, all the components of cholesterol numbers, significantly. Right? And that's so much so that it made it to the guidelines. The number one parameter that we should be talking to our patients, friends, and family when it comes to lipid lowering is healthy lifestyle. Everything else comes next. That should be the first foundation. Right? Same thing with diabetes. We have multiple sets of databases, extremely well done, large randomized controlled trials that clearly showed that lifestyle-based strategies are extremely useful in prevention, treating, and potentially putting type 2 diabetes into remission. And the 2019 American Diabetes Association guidelines support various kind of diets. But if you look at them, Majority of them are predominantly whole food, plant-based diets. The American Association of Clinical Endocrinology, on the other hand, is telling us that lifestyle therapies begin with nutrition to prevent, treat, and potentially put type 2 diabetes into remission. And they are going completely out and saying all patients should primarily be on a plant-based diet. And if you want to read a book, the number one secret diabetes is, no matter what you eat, as healthy as food, it has to somehow or the other, it has to boil down to, at the end of the day, eating less calories. And I strongly support and suggest this book. If you're a diabetic, if your family member is a diabetic, is to read this book by Roy Taylor. And I had done some phenomenal basic research and clinical research on this, and wrote a book for lay people, non-medical people. I strongly urge you to read that book. And if you do all of this, what do the prevention guidelines tell, at least in the US, which are pretty much applicable to anywhere in the world, because, yes, we are different, but not that different, right? And that when it comes to the diet part, the American College of Cardiology and American Heart Association diet recommendation, except for maybe small portions of fish, is in full support of a fully plant-based diet, right? And that dietary pattern, again, gets a class 1 indication. Right. So when you think of a plant-based diet, we want to make sure that you get the message right. Right. So French fries are also plant-based. Oreo cookies are French fries. All the sodas that we drink are also plant-based. That doesn't mean that they're health promoting. So there's actually beautiful clinical outcomes data showing that the types of plant-based food have health outcomes. So just because something is plant-based, please don't eat junk food. And this is extremely applicable to the Indian society, right? We are quote unquote vegetarians. But if you really stop and think about it for a second, our vegetarianism is pseudo-vegetarianism. Our food is overcooked. Our food is loaded with butter and oil. Our food is loaded with salt and sugar. Yes, it is vegetarian, but it is not health promoting. And when I ask people to eat predominantly a plant-based diet, people perceive that we eat like this. This is all we have to eat. But turns out that taking these simple ingredients, fruits, vegetables, lentils, and beans, which we have no shortage of in India, right? There are hundreds of different types of lentils, beans, and whole grains in India. It's just a matter of how to cook like our ancestors used to cook, right? So we can make meals that look like this, that are nutrient. So in a nutshell, don't eat crap, calorie rich and processed food, and eat food, not too much, mostly or exclusively plants. And here is a plate put forth by the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. This is what our plates should look like. Half of our plate should be filled with fruits and vegetables. The rest with lentils, beans, nuts, and some very, very small quantities of processed grains if you want to do it, or just whole grains. The next pillar that we don't talk much about is sleep. Gandhi said this famously, that each night when I go to sleep, I die. The next morning, I wake up to be reborn. Right? And sleep, extremely important. 7 to 8 hours. 7 to 8 hours is this window for every single health-related parameter, head to toe. Now there's a lot of new data coming out that sleep may be directly related to dementia. And it's just not about the duration of sleep, the quality of sleep, and how many times you actually wake up. So make sleep a priority. And we can do an entire discussion on sleep. I think my wife already did that. So sleep duration and diabetes, right? If you're diabetics, and you'll know this, the nights when you don't sleep well, the next morning you will see a spike in your glucose. Extreme. And sleep is being considered, people who do night shift work for years and years, it is considered as a probable carcinogen. There may be some link to lack of sleep causing some through some mechanism. We don't know that. So my please, don't let your sleep become a dream. And after all of this science-based messaging, what we will hear from our patients, friends, and family. Doc, this disease runs in my family. So here is a story. That's why I put this in quote. These were the words by somebody. I'll tell you who that person is. That there are no old men in my family. All branches of my family tree have been cut short by cardiovascular disease. I believe the people in this room have the power and even a duty to change that. These were the words by a 47-year-old cardiologist who just happens to be the president of American Heart Association in 2017, who a day before had a massive heart attack while attending the American Heart Association meeting. That's what he said, is that because he had a heart attack and a lot of this disease is genetic and it's in his family. But it turns out that we have data from 4 large clinical research databases that clearly show that by living a healthy lifestyle, by not smoking, keeping a BMI below 30, and being physically active, and eat at least halfway decent, if you did that, you can lower the risk of a cardiovascular event by almost 50%, even in the setting of a high genetic risk. I just want to repeat this one more time. Even in the setting of a high genetic risk, if you live a healthy lifestyle, you can lower the risk of actually having a cardiovascular event by close to 50%. So healthy, and based on papers like this, there's another paper titled "Healthy Living is the Best Revenge." Why do we say that? That by using those healthy living parameters, you can lower the risk of any chronic disease by 78%, diabetes by 93%, heart attack by 81%, stroke by 50%, and all cancers by 36%. Nothing I know in medicine is this powerful. Right? So this is something extreme. This is an issue that can no longer wait. Health promotion and disease prevention. This should be the primary modality of everything that we do. So that's my message. And we need to flip this pyramid of tertiary care to health promotion. Majority of the world's health care is based on hospital-based medicine. If we really care for health care, we should prioritize health of the society, not the disease management of the society. So I'll stop here, and this is a nonprofit I run. Look us up on Facebook and look us up on social media, and we have a website. This is my wife and I. We founded this a couple of years ago to take this message selflessly to as many communities as possible locally here in where we live across the country in the U.S. But now we are reaching India and other places. So if I can be of any help and assistance, those are my emails. I'm on Twitter as Koushik Reddy MD. So you can reach me through these social media or my emails. So I will stop here. Again, thank you for giving me the opportunity. And if you have any questions, I will be more than happy to do it. Again, I apologize if I went a little longer than the allotted time.